Yep. Here it is. All right, Will. Recording in real time. Real time. Real time. Real time. Real time. Recording in real time. Recording video in real time. Cool, he says. So cool. Deranged. Spastic. Weird. But cool. So cool. And yet somehow he does not join the video call at the highest optimum provided for him. The highest fidelity. Okay, here he is now. Speak of the devil. I was going to deny you. But this is the thing, is that I like the idea of admitting you more. It said admit or deny. So
These glasses are getting to your head, man.
if it said accept or deny, I would have done deny. But it says admit and deny. It's the semantics. I just like that word.
Yeah.
I felt like the college board of Princeton or whatever.
That's
The
really
admissions team.
exactly.
The Ivy
Well,
League.
it's like an admission of guilt, but
For your grad school paradigm, right? What are you applying for? Neuroscience Masters of Science from the University of King's College London.
I'm actually studying the science of mastery.
You're studying the science of what's your science? If you had a science, your science would be like nephrology or something.
Ooh.
You'd be something a little bit creepy, but also benign. Like you just kind of walk around like thinking about kidneys all day. And then, and then people would call you like at your drab office, and they would be like, "Hey, tell me about these kidneys, guy." And then you'd be like, "Well, where do you start? There's so much to know about it."
Yeah.
And you start talking about like the inner kidney, the outer kidney, the middle kidney,
it's like nephron. An onion. It has almost infinite layers.
Yeah, I mean, you're already doing it now. You're already fetishizing the kidney because you're a child molester. Oh, sorry, a kidney molester.
Are you recording? It doesn't look like you are. Are you using the?
I've been recording for 3 minutes and 25 seconds, fucker.
Damn.
Right there.
Is it working?
Right there.
It actually working?
Yeah, it's live video, dude. It's magic.
Oh, wow, that's awesome. Okay, well, I'm suddenly feeling the charm and the smarm and the salt.
The smarm, a lot of smarm for sure. A lot of schmaltz too. I'm the schmarm, you're the schmaltz.
Yeah.
And together we're the schmees.
I can't go that far. Where you go, I cannot follow.
All right, so we watched the movie.
Yeah, we did.
We watched a couple movies. I watched a little bit of Mad Max. And then he watched a little bit of Blues Brothers.
Yeah.
And then I watched something else, and he didn't want to watch it because of some sort of statute of limitations fear he had. He didn't know how long he'd have to rattle in his head that movie after he had seen it.
Oh gosh.
So if it was 5 years, he would have done it, but he was afraid it might have been 10. So statute of limitations for him. But we saw Blues Brothers.
Yeah.
And 1980. Do you know who directed that? Classic film.
No, I don't.
Superbly classic film. John Landis directed it.
Okay. What else has he done?
He also did the sequel, Blues Brothers 2000.
Yeah, I see he did Animal House.
And yeah, well, that's what I was gonna like fact check it, but that was a supposition on my part. that I was hiding from you was that he did Animal House. Where's your background? You look like you're you're just looking at child porn or something.
Oh, you really took me off guard.
You look like you're in a sanatorium, man, in like the 1920s, like a pre-war sort of like drug den. I mean, at least I have the dignity to fly.
You know what it is?
To aviate.
You're recording this from the back seat of your biplane.
Yeah.
Triplane.
Yeah, I'm the Red Baron, dude. Don't you know?
Yeah.
Well, I'm his cousin, the Blue Baron.
Emphasis on the red.
I'm the liberal Baron of the Nazis. Yeah. Oh, sorry, they weren't Nazis. My mistake. The Weimar Republic or whatever the fuck. The Imperial, German, Red Baron, Blue Baron, dichotomy. Matrix, red pill, blue pill dichotomy. By the way, John Landis directed this Blues Brothers super phenomenal film. It had, obviously John, the guy who died. Dan Aykroyd plays the taller Blues brother. And then you have John, I was gonna say Cusack, not Cusack. Who is that guy? Everyone knows his name from Animal House, right?
Belushi.
John Belushi, brother of Jim Belushi. John Belushi plays the shorter one. Very funny. He excellent delivery of dialogue on his part, I would say. Both the guys dance, like this hilarious dancing. That's almost like makes the movie itself. It's just the way they like move around. Like you could put them anywhere and it would just fly, like a fly off the rails. The other thing is that there's an incredible like fidelity to sort of like the wholesome 80s, like in late 70s sense of humor. Humor sensibility. Like you have the sort of the nun sequence, and then you have the sequence with the blues master, and then you have these sequences. They're like almost like too pure in their expression to be done today. It would be seen as so cheesy, but back then,
definitely.
There wasn't enough profanity or something in those sequences for them to be done today. But that's what makes them legendary. You almost feel like they're. I mean, if it were done today, it would be an homage, basically. To
it would be purposefully campy or something, and somehow it's not at all.
Yeah, it would look like a cheap SNL bit sketch.
Yeah, it's like it's obviously a joke. It's it's meant to be a joke, but it also is like it's kind of like it's not really that ironic. It's not like it's very salt of the earth, bread and butter kind of thing.
Bread and butter, dude.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of annoyed. I actually took some notes on it because I thought it was so interesting, but I can't find
Well,
them.
my favorite scene probably is when they drive over the toll bridge or whatever.
Yeah.
What's it called? What is it called?
Oh, just the beginning. Yeah, the drawbridge.
The drawbridge, right? When they jump over the drawbridge at the beginning, probably my favorite scene because it's just so iconic and emphatic to like the identity that they have as bluesmen, and then they also have this sort of bluesmobile concept. It's not. I mean, I wouldn't call it like laugh out loud funny, but it's certainly like sticks in your mind and it's charming.
Yeah.
The scene with the nun was good too. She just kicks them down a flight of stairs. She raised them. They were orphans. That's good. It's a little, anti-Catholic, a little, kind of like toes the secular line a little bit too much, but it's a functioning scene.
And it's not. I mean, go ahead.
And then obviously the part where they reunite with their musician sort of father figure was pretty good too. That was a little bit campy also, but in 1980, like campy didn't really even exist as a concept.
Yeah.
As a derogatory, or sorry, the pejorative term.
Yeah.
I don't know what derogatory, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's sort of coming back to me now. I kind of think the best part of the movie for me was sort of just the beginning. I feel like there's this weird thing where in those 80s movies, it's almost like pop culture and high art almost sort of meet for a second. And that's what makes all those movies so interesting. Like they're really gratuitous in their artistry, and yet they're like dumb movies. Like the first scene is like 5 minutes of just like silence and just this guy getting escorted out, and there are these little jokes,
It's
but it's
not
mostly just
even that well shot, or like the production value is really low. But then, and
yeah,
so you're watching the first scene, like, what is this movie that I just, I spent
yeah.
money
Well, I
on?
mean,
Or
I would say that it is well shot, and that the cinematography, just in those random opening prison scenes, is like more like artful than a lot of like supposedly highbrow stuff you see these days. But and like he walks out, he's like walking out of prison, and there's like light behind him, and they meet, and then they just like hug or something.
I mean, it wasn't like the Shawshank Redemption level of like in quality, but it definitely was better than something you might see now on the internet, for free. Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something very special about that threshold of the like 70s and the 80s, which Mad Max kind of is as well. Because like they're like at the very end of this kind of grunginess of the 70s, which is very interesting. Like there are a lot of shots in that movie where like I think one of the opening shots is over this like giant like oil field or something. It's like this giant industrial scape that's just totally lifeless and like really mechanical and well, really industrial and like heavy industrial. And it's just like a weird, it's just strange. As well as like the shots of just the depths of the city, like their little motel room, their flop house room, like right outside the railway
Oh
station.
yeah, and then Carrie
Pretty
Fisher
nothing.
drives up and shoots at them with a rocket launcher.
Yeah, that whole thing, like that whole that whole sequence of her like this sort of comedy of her trying to kill them. Frankly, I didn't find the movie like funny at all, but like it was so interesting that like it made up for it. Like I get there's just a dumb slapstick and obviously she's his ex-girlfriend or something, but like the fact that she just appears and like starts like shooting missiles at them and they never mention it, it's like more interesting than it's funny. It's like not very funny. It's just like
Well, it's like
weird.
intriguing. That's what it is. It's and mildly captivating.
Yeah.
Carrie
And
Fisher
also
obviously had been in the first Star Wars film at this point, so she would
yeah,
have been recognizable.
yeah,
I think that kind of adds to the mystique in that sequence.
yeah,
However, that was a really brief sequence, and I think the more notable part in it, honestly, is the motel they were going to was like such a hole in the wall
yeah,
that it seemed like it wouldn't even exist at all, even in the early '80s, early '80s.
yeah, yeah. It does seem like such a
What was the signage? It was like musicians motel. It was like something totally off the chain, like
oh, there was a sign that said like vagrants welcomed or
vagrants
something.
welcome.
Like
That's what it was. Yeah,
I mean,
just
that's a
like
joke,
hilarious.
but again, it's like not that funny. It's just like strange.
Well, I think it really depends on your mindset. Like
Yeah,
if you think the world falls into that line, you might find it
yeah,
funny. If you think the world doesn't fall into that line, well, you probably wouldn't. So
okay.
it really just depends on what your ideal for society is.
Well, what your expectation is, you know?
What your expectation is for a person, like a given person, and what you
Yeah,
prefer someone to experience if you had the choice,
yeah,
um, had to choose, right? And then the other thing is, my favorite scene was shortly after that one, which was when they went to get their old bandmate back
yeah,
out from his square job, and they go and
yeah.
get the the not the concierge but the maitre d at this restaurant, a really
Oh,
nice
yeah.
French restaurant. And you know who the maitre d is? It's Pee Wee Herman.
Oh, yeah. I remember that. He
Yeah,
briefly
he doesn't
shows
look
up.
like it. I confused him with someone from a different movie I had watched
Yeah.
on an airplane. Can't remember what, but it was also an '80s film, like something.
I
And
mean,
I
yeah,
totally confused him with that guy. So I looked him up to see if they were the same character, or sorry, same actor. And it turns out the
yeah,
maitre d was not that guy. The maitre d was Pee Wee Herman before he was famous.
yeah, yeah. No, I recognize them.
And
I mean,
they
yeah,
in that scene they try to like they harass all the customers at these round tables, these white
mainly
tablecloths.
Belushi. Yeah,
Yeah, John Belushi does this, where he harasses them and he tells them he's going to steal their kids and steal
yeah,
all the women. And it's sort of like this like gross, human trafficking joke, but it
yeah.
was so larger than life that it didn't really seem like threatening. I don't know, like it was
Yeah,
sort
well, I think the joke was that he was like, acting outrageous to like get the goat of the guy who they wanted to join the band. But like to me, that scene didn't really work because like, why wouldn't the guy just be like, I'm gonna call the police, or just it was played as if this scene where like, oh, I can't do anything. They're gonna just tickle me and torment me until I have to do what they say. But like, I don't understand where that comes from. Like, you can't just order champagne and everything and drink it all and we're gonna come back every day. Like that makes no sense. Like you'd immediately be arrested. Like I don't.
Why?
Yeah.
I don't understand. Say like, why would he be arrested?
Well, if you dine and dash at a really expensive restaurant, really fancy restaurant.
Yeah, well, this is back when it was really hard to like find people compared to
I
now.
guess.
Back
Yeah,
then,
but
it was hard to
yeah,
find
but if they
people.
say, "Oh, we're gonna come back every day," then just by the third day, the police,
Yeah, well, I guess you're made to assume that like the maitre d' covered it, because they're manipulating him.
Yeah, but like what I'm saying is like the power dynamics don't really make sense. Like he is a maitre d', but it's not like he has no clout. Like he could just call the police or forcibly make them leave. There's nothing that they're like hanging over his that they can hang over his head. So it just doesn't make sense to me. I mean, I feel like it's just an excuse to have them both act
No, no.
outrageous or
What
something.
they can do, they can do is they can show up every day and harass the patrons.
I just think they could just be arrested or
No, but
something.
he's not going to arrest them because he's their old bandmate.
Yeah, so he wouldn't. So that'd be like breaking some kind of street code or something.
Yeah, I mean he's like their buddy. They're like friends, so he wouldn't want to do that.
Yeah, but like they're not really his friends. They're being total. I mean,
No, they are
I
his
guess,
friends.
I guess, I guess
He got
that's
a square job as a
yeah,
waiter, maitre d'
yeah.
waiter or
That is
whatever.
kind of a good point that the band is like a higher goal.
Yeah,
It still
exactly. You
doesn't.
see, one thing you don't understand is you don't understand music. I mean, how many songs do you remember from it? Do you even remember Sweet Home Chicago?
No, none of the songs really. I didn't really like any of the music.
You don't like any
Honestly.
of the blues? That was like one of the best parts is the blues.
Oh no, and you know what? When they were in like downtown or whatever, right before they went to the chicken place, those guys, that was some good music.
Okay, all right.
Otherwise, I'm
Yeah, I
not
also
into
liked when he
it.
takes the cigarette lighter, he throws it out. He's like, "This car sucks." They drive over the drawbridge. He lands. And he's like, "What do you think now of the new Bluesmobile?" And he's like,
Yeah,
"You fixed the cigarette lighter."
yeah, yeah,
That was clever.
yeah. It
That's
was
all he
nice.
says too. He's just end scene. And
Yeah, it is entertaining to watch them both like be badasses
it
constantly.
actually reminds me in some ways of Mad Max because it's that sort
No,
of
yeah,
derelict,
yeah,
dark, toned down 1979 year vision of like
yeah,
of a bleak society, the
yeah,
underbelly.
yeah. Combined with like car chases and exploding vehicles. I mean, like so many. Honestly, near the end, it was so over the top, and it's just like it's unbelievable. Like the dozens of police cars that are just smashed into each other, and then like the national guard. I mean, we're kind of getting ahead of ourselves. Like
Well,
the army.
it was like GTA before that was even a known meme. It really was. It was like this like mayhem,
Yeah, yeah.
total
No, they had like
mayhem.
a 5-star wanted level.
It reminds me a little bit of that film, Pacino film with by not Brian De Palma, by who Sidney Lumet did Dog Day Afternoon.
Oh yeah,
And at the end, they have just like fuck tons of squad cars like surrounding them at the
yeah,
on the tarmac when he's trying to get on the plane and fly to wherever the Bahamas, I think.
yeah. Well, I mean, this was even bigger. This was like
Yeah, well, no, but I'm saying I think that was a sort of like a cinematic
that was
predecessor.
what was ramping into like this ultimate spectacle of like the whole world converging on these guys.
Yeah, well, speaking of '80s connections, right? Like there's a in Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Yeah,
You've seen the Breakfast Club, right?
yeah, I have
Yeah,
years
okay, well,
ago. Yeah,
so similar along those lines as the Ferris Bueller's Day Off is also a John Hughes film.
yeah,
I don't know if it was 85 or I don't know the exact year. Breakfast Club was 85,
yeah,
but in Ferris Bueller's Day Off, what's his name? forget the actor, but the dude Agnes, the side character, the car was stolen by the valets and driven over a drawbridge.
Oh yeah.
Or some kind of it's driven over some kind of jump where it flies for a while. Yeah. And then you hear this symphonic rise like da 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 da, just like symphonic music swelling, and then the car of course lands and it's totally fine. The valets return to the parking garage, but that reminds me distinctly of that Blues Brothers intro.
Well, what you're saying reminds me of the demise of the Nazis near the end.
Oh, that was a good scene, yeah, where they just pummeled them, like they just basically threw them in a river, yeah. And they were like, oh, Illinois Nazis. I hate Illinois Nazis. Like they had to qualify it. Yeah. I thought that was kind of clever. I didn't really know what that meant, but they were like, oh, look at these guys, they're Nazis in Illinois. Oh, Illinois Nazis, those are the worst.
Yeah,
it's like what? Aren't they all the same?
No, I'm talking about that at the end where like they drive off the overpass, and then suddenly they're like above the entire city of Chicago.
The Nazis are.
Yeah, they plummet.
Yeah, no, that sounds about right. Yeah. I mean, they never had anything good coming for them. And then the other thing was the police that were obsessed with them. They're stalking them the whole time. The detectives. Yeah. And he's like, I'm gonna catch them if it's the last thing I ever do. Yeah. And then what is the last thing he ever does?
I don't know. What do you mean?
Well, I guess he didn't catch him, but.
Yeah. Well, no, don't they? They don't die. They just pull out and crash into the Cowboys, and I think that's the last we see of them, right?
Yeah, I suppose so, man. I suppose so. So there is a sequel to it called Blues Brothers 2000.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's the third installment or if that's just the only sequel.
Yeah, I think it's the only sequel.
And they had some SNL, sketches where they did the song and dance, and of course, when John Belushi dies, they have to replace him with I forget who, but someone else. They replace him for the sequel, and it's sort of like not the same jam. But one thing that is cool about the sequel is that I caught a scene of it is that they try to include more styles of music in the repertoire of the Blues Brothers. There's a scene where they're like, oh, he's like, hey man, we play funk, we play disco, we play rock and roll, we play blues, we play gospel, but we will not play Caribbean music. And then this weird goddess lady like ascends from her like royal throne and zaps them with electricity, and then all of a sudden they start playing Caribbean music and like with like with the supersized Blues Brothers band. In this case, it includes like Steve Cropper from Booker T and the MGs and all these legends and stuff. So it was a very interesting sequence in the sequel that I thought was like in the same rank as the as the better stuff in the first one. And the other thing is the sequel has a lot of distinctively like early aughts moments. Like late 90s, early aughts sort of stylistic choices.
Like what?
Well, like just having the Caribbean be there at all in any way, shape, or form is something that you wouldn't get in 1980, right? It's a little too random. It's what's it called? Like scattered.
It's a bit esoteric.
Esoteric, yeah. I mean, it's for the 80s, early 80s, yeah. But then by the year 2000, like sort of fringe demographics like Caribbean Americans and Mexican Americans and stuff, they are having a lot more pull with the media, and they had more pull with culture in general. So you get that kind of representation all of a sudden.
Yeah.
But it was tastefully done is the point. Like there was a significant chance that they would have just sort of been shoehorned in, but I thought that movie was effective at presenting those perspectives in an appealing way.
Yeah, I mean, I think in total, the movie was definitely like inspired, like somehow hugely inspired and full of energy. But I just thought it was like way too long. Honestly, didn't hold my interest the entire time.
So did you like Mad Max more?
Yeah, I liked Mad Max 1. By Mad Max 2, I was kind of over it. Just because Mad Max 1 is like so not what I expected at all and like
Yeah.
so interesting. It's like so interesting in so many weird little ways. Like the weird shirtless, like semi-gay guy named like Puppy or something. He's named like
Yeah,
Goofy.
there was a homoeroticism to it that kind of threw me off. However, there was sort of like an
Not expected.
avant-garde style to, it's
Yeah.
Australian, right? So there was, or I think so.
Yeah.
This his style was very like new wave.
Yeah, no, I read about both the movies and reading about Blues Brothers, I stumbled upon this bizarre, like apparently at that moment, part of the reason the movie got so much funding was like Jim Belushi or whichever one he is was
John
like
Belushi.
John
By the way,
Belushi
the
was like
music in Blues Brothers is way better than the music in Mad Max. Let's just clarify.
I don't even remember any of the music of Mad Max. I could,
Exactly.
exactly, yeah,
Case in point.
but yeah, and he was like this mega star who just that's why the movie I remember watching like when the like 57th police car like exploded like this must have cost so much. It's like incredible. This is like the budget of an epic. But well that's to say yeah. So he was like this huge star at the time and apparently he would just like wander into random people's homes and like eat from their fridge because like everyone loved him so much that he could like do anything. And there's a couple of scenes in the movie where he's like noticeably congested, which I noticed. But you know,
John
because
Belushi, dude, what a guy, dude.
yeah, but I hate to say it, like I don't really get like why he didn't seem to be like a superhuman like beacon of charisma. You know, like the whole movie is set up in
No,
this way where
it's
it's like
almost it's. I think it's more in the opposite. Is that he's almost like a deadpan.
yeah, well I know, but there's still meant to be some kind of like I guess like I was reading this thing about how huge he was, just didn't see like why should this guy didn't make sense to me. I mean, I get it, you know. But what is like the movie sets things up like with room for like, the audience to be like, yes, it's him. Oh my god, it's like you know. And I guess he had to be there. And then with
Well,
Mad Max,
he's also. I think he's also in Stripes. Is he not?
I don't know.
I mean, he's in quite a few movies, and he's always kind of this deadpan. Jane Silent Bob.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay, maybe he's not in Stripes. Although I don't see why he wouldn't be. Yeah,
But yeah,
Neighbors. He's in something called Neighbors.
something I read about Mad Max was that they were trying to make like kind of like a silent movie.
Yeah.
And I think you see that in the second one as well, but certainly in the first one, like you don't really expect how artful the visual aspect of it is or will be. It's just very like it does seem like this like Buster Keaton esque thing, which is again unexpected for this like pseudo post apocalyptic movie. It's
Well,
also
well,
artsy and like
well,
how
well,
little they explain.
well keep in mind, man. Um, John Belushi was probably more famous for his time in Saturday Night Live
That was the entire thing, I think.
than,
But
than his
like,
actual like cinematic portrayals.
well, yeah, but I guess what I'm saying is, I think,
Buster Keaton
yeah,
has sort of a
I
time.
think everyone. Well, that's just the same thing. But I don't know. That's all just to say I didn't. It
Well,
really
what's good
shows.
is Harold Lloyd is good too. Like I prefer him to Buster Keaton, frankly, because I think the humor aged better than Buster Keaton's
Yeah,
sensibility for humor. And Chaplin
yeah.
too. I think Harold Lloyd's humor aged better.
Well, and speaking of things aging, the prevailing impression I got of Blues Brothers was just
You're cutting out, man. Slow down a little. Don't worry too much because you're cutting out.
all right. I just got this sense of it really seemed to encapsulate a lot that has been lost. And maybe that's just the lens by which I see a lot of things, but Mad Max didn't make me feel that way.
No, well, Mad
So
Max is almost like I almost feel like this weird nostalgia. It's like primeval. You feel like you want to like it makes you want to like jump out of your chair and just break apart your like windowsill. And I like it really encourages some sort of like narcissistic self destruction. And the other thing is that there's like the sincerity to the way people are in that film that I didn't expect. Like for instance, they still have all the same sort of like, bars and like police station houses and sort of general infrastructure that you'd find in like a relatively stable society. But the caveat is that there's like a criminal underground that sort of just charges through everything and strips the dignity away at will.
What's sort of so fascinating about it is it's not, you expect it to be Mad Max 2. Like that's what I thought Mad Max 1 would be. But it's this society that's like teetering and like is currently fraying and sort of collapsing, and you don't even know how much it has collapsed, which is just such an interesting. You don't really see. I mean, like Children of Men is kind of like that. You don't see a lot of movies that are like, most movies are either after the apocalypse or like the apocalypse is definitively chunked somewhere in the movie and there's before and after. With Mad Max is like this weird gray area that you don't. I just find that fascinating and it's really enjoyable, especially because Australia is already sort of so.
I mean that, but in the '79, a lot of films are kind of leaning into that punk aesthetic. They, it wasn't really like an underground phenomenon anymore, and the this whole like anarchical neo-tribalism that was burbling up, that was kind of like almost passe in '79 to some extent. And Mad Max wasn't like original for doing that in many ways, but Mad Max was sort of a defining film that really showed that sensibility had arrived in the public imagination. But I don't but I don't think I don't want to give it too much credit. Like we talked about Terminator before, but Terminator also has that sort of thing. The Warriors was a movie that had that aesthetic in I think it delivered it in a more compelling way in a lot of, because in the Warriors they like there's a sense of there's a sense of like everyone's sort of agreeing on this necessary evil, do you know?
Yeah.
Whereas in Mad Max, the characters they all seem so distraught about the world they live in. But in the Warriors, everyone like they're participating in the gangs. They just don't like the way the gangs are operated at the time. But they still like the gang life.
They take it for granted. It's like they're just seen as a neutral reality. Whereas in Mad Max, it's this socially corrupting, corrosive force. I think also something that like
also the dialogue in the Warriors is a bit better, but Mad Max has a lot is just more visual of a film, far more visual.
Yeah, I think Mad Max has some good. It has some good dialogue. I mean, it's pretty sort of unadorned, but it's good.
Unadorned for sure, but that's an artistic decision. And they like the scenes on the beach or the scenes where they had this sort of like Caesarian figure with the leader of the wrongful gang, and he was sort of like he would just kill people as when he puts the shotgun barrel into the mouth of that guy, and sort of it's like there's this weird tinge, there's this homoerotic tinge that sort of like makes you freeze a bit and reassess why you're watching the film. Even you're like, is this really an action movie or is this sort of an art flick? It all kind of unravels for me. It kind of unraveled a bit at that point, because I thought the film was going to be more like how I remembered it watching it on TV as a kid, which was like this sort of like a popcorn flick. But really, it's got this like sort of like edgy message that is countercultural in intention.
Yeah, no, it is. It's a very dark movie, and it's not, basically Mad Max.
It's almost insubordinate. It's almost like it reminds me a little bit of like a Reservoir Dogs or some such. Natural Born Killers, even. Yeah, it's but it's iconic for sure, and I can't believe that third they made the who's the director's name? George something. George Miller.
George Miller?
Yeah, George Miller. He made the third one a few years ago, maybe 5-6 years ago.
Oh, the remake?
It was like a threequel. It was the third.
Oh, Beyond Thunderdome.
Yeah, that one. Yeah, and that one was truly post-apocalyptic, and it was also which the first one sort of isn't. The first one is still like just on the margin of society, but it's still within a society. There's like, for instance, the police are like very cavalier about their police work. They're almost cocksure about being able to get the job done, despite evidence to the contrary. But in the threequel, they're literally on the run from like a slaver cult run by, I guess, like almost like a reincarnation of this sort of same animist that you see in the villain in the first one.
Yeah.
And there's also sort of a lesbianic connotation in the third movie that kind of defied the tendencies from the first two, but wasn't exactly out of the aesthetic either. It's still kind of kept in line.
Yeah, just in the same sense of crazy tribal punk stuff.
I don't know why lesbianism is punk. I have no idea, but I guess that's kind of the association now.
Yeah, I mean the big thing for me for those two movies, we just strangely I find them really like non-cathartic and sort of non-satisfying. Like in the first one, Max is set up to be this like ultimate badass, like, oh, we better call him Mad Max, like he'll do it, and he does manage to sort of, he kind of manages to kill that crazy guy, but in the end he just sort of loses, and the big bad Caesar guy, he doesn't really get him in any satisfying way. I mean, I heard that George Miller made that movie based off of, in part, like the experience of being like an ER doctor and just seeing all these horrible injuries. And I feel like that sense of this meaningless carnage is like really deeply written into the movie. Like, because you don't really get the catharsis of, you have at the end where he's like, oh, you better saw your own arm off. But that whelp kid was not the main villain. That was just like a stupid whelp kid. Like, he's almost not even worth killing, although he is killed in a cathartic way. But like,
there's definitely a fetishistic body horror quality to it that is like it's like leaning into the Cronenberg tendency, where it's like it's like bloodlust for the sake of bloodlust. There's no actual glory in it at all, or redemption.
But I would say there's this sense of the meaningless that you get with a sort of car accident that just pervades the whole movie, and there's no real redemption from that. In the second movie, there is kind of, even then, Max is like struggling to even get his gun. He just never. There's no scene where his direct intention is to kill some guy, and he does, as far as I know. Particularly, never the bad guy.
He's always kind of like this, kind of got this faint sort of look in his eye a little. He doesn't seem like he's really embodied and fully present with his intentions. It's almost like
he's not in control.
It's almost like he knows he's not in control, and he's just sort of resigned himself to that, and he does kind of like some sort of personal minimum.
Yeah, I mean, to that point in the second movie, like I don't know if you saw the second one, but like near the end when they're on that tanker car or whatever, like two pretty important characters just die, like without much comment. They just like fall off the thing, and then that's it.
This is the third one? Wait, this is the third one? The second one?
This is the second one.
Okay. Because they had something like that in the third one, too.
Yeah, and again, I think that's almost part of the identity of the movies is it's just this sense, it's sort of nihilistic, but what I guess it really is just showing that, like, it's this kind of cathartic working through of the meaninglessness of car crashes or something. I mean, I don't want to simplify it too much.
It's a cathartic. It's actually it's the Mortito. It's the death wish we have as citizens in a rigid society where the regulation gets to our heads and we want to actually like plummet into self-destruction and bodily harm and self-harm, all that.
Wow.
And that's the catharsis. Is it we get this sense of like, oh, this aggravating need to destroy ourselves is gratified.
Yeah, and the more meaningless that is, the better. So I see what you mean. It's cathartic in this weird sort of negative sense.
It's also Australian. It's very Australian. Very Australian. Yeah. I think America is a little more restricted about that kind of behavior, but Australia is a lot more cowboy, and it's a lot more punchy and just sort of adventurous, physically interactive.
I mean, the weird thing is it's almost not cowboy because, the cowboy typically does shoot the bad guy. It doesn't all just descend into this anarchic, endlessly spiraling.
Well, I mean, cowboy is sort of in between that and like a noir, where like the justice is served.
Noir is like a really rigid good and evil. Cowboy, the frontier itself is like, because the cowboy is kind of his own law, so he kind of is not really. He's not really like the agent of. He is the agent of justice in a very direct way, which ends up kind of subverting justice itself. That's why
The
cowboys kind
cowboy
of.
in American cinema and literary fiction or just paperback fiction is sort of a representation of the coy dictator who calls the shots but doesn't want to be recognized for having that
Yeah,
power. And so
yeah,
and that's something that's kind of on the mind of people who live in the countryside in the States, I think. But I don't think that's the case in Australia for whatever reason. Australia's just got a different game. They have a lot more desert and
yeah,
less arable land on the coasts than even the
yeah,
United States, which I think does have way too much desert anyway. But
yeah.
um, and the other thing is I forgot what it was. It was tying into something. Oh yeah. What's it, Mel Gibson? He looks so young in these movies. Like
Yeah.
it seemed younger than I even knew he could be. Like
Yeah, no, yeah, he doesn't look like himself. He looks like, some teen,
he looks
like,
like a teenager portraying Mel Gibson almost, like a different
yeah,
actor. And you
yeah,
forget that
he
like
does.
Mel Gibson is like I always thought he was young enough, and now I realize he was always like a middle aged man in my head. Didn't really realize it because I just never saw him in his earliest films. Um,
Yeah,
in a recognizing sort of lens. I mean, I've seen these films and bits and pieces before, but I never like processed it enough to be like, okay, Mel Gibson is right before me in center, whatever it is, a center wide or a wide shot or whatever. I never full shot,
yeah,
I never had the capability to recognize him because I think the reason is that he's in such an unusual role even for himself,
yeah,
and the settings even makes it more so. The setting is really bizarre. So
yeah,
and then the other, the villains make everything is out extreme in these movies. And
yeah.
that's the one thing I think it really is consistent with Blues Brothers, other than it being very vehicular.
You mean the commonality?
The commonality, yeah, is that it's very vehicular, but it's also very like
Yeah,
it's this rotation of extremes, just sort of dizzying up the place. It's a circus.
yeah,
It's a flying circus, a driving circus, and that's the same with the Blues Brothers,
yeah,
the Warriors too, I suppose, but definitely Mad Max and Blues Brothers.
yeah. No, that's a good point. They really both have in common. They're about, yeah, just this crazy, intense energy
But
associated
it's
with
still
all.
centered. It's still coolly centered, like it's organized chaos. Um,
Yeah,
and the Terminator in a way is like that as well. I mean, these are all these four movies are in the same year or two,
mhm,
so
yeah,
they typify the era that they were wrought from.
yeah. The sense of sort of technological destruction.
The
uh,
impending, technocracy. Uh,
That is, yeah, that's actually really good. I mean, remember in Blues Brothers where like they only get caught because they have this thing with like a funny name, like the PUD or the Sputs, the Squamch. It means like the county database system for tagging perps. And it's like when I saw that, I got this sense, and I got the sense from the whole movie that like just what you said, impending technocracy, like the movie is like the fullest like high watermark of like the pre-digital world, sort of, in that there
yeah,
are all these deeply steeped cultural institutions and
an
tropes like, oh,
apotheosis.
blues versus country, you better not play no blues, like all this weird stuff that no one
Oh
cares
yeah,
about
that
anymore.
that 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 like racist moment where they played rawhide because they couldn't
Yeah,
they were
and it's
getting
just like,
bottles
and
thrown at them in
I
the
was thinking in
cage.
that scene, like nobody would care, like no one would care that much today. I don't think there's enough like fervid country fans or whatever in the world.
That like
That's not,
unashamed like collective racism
it's just,
probably wouldn't exist most of the time in a country bar, but it could but I don't think even back then it would have. I think that was sort of a mock up.
well, that's a very good point. You're right. It's a trope. It's like a funny trope, like, oh, of course the dumb rednecks. But the fact is, like, there was this whole like silo of accumulated tropes, and I sort of feel that it reached its almost like its peak
It's
point.
zenith.
Yeah, around like 1980 or so, right before the
Yeah,
digital
well,
sort of
you're right.
revolution.
You're hitting on something on the head. I think there's mean, not to play whack-a-mole too much, but I think there is some connection to World War II sort of becoming more of like an old man's memory, and then the '60s sort of becoming more of like the working person's in their lexicon, right? And
I think
their repertoire, let's say. Like I think there was this dialectic between like the basic values from the silent generation of World War II, and then there's the sort of the avant-garde values that were promulgated in the '60s, late '60s, early '70s, civil rights and all that, free love.
Those don't really win and become
And
alive
those
until
become
the
like the left and the right of American thought. The one arm, the right arm and the left arm, and they're always kind of operating in tandem in this like perpetual boxing exercise. But sometimes people just work that right arm or they work that left arm, and it's like one gets weaker, one gets stronger depending on how much you use them. And I think in 1980 it was like there was this obsession with that old world, that older 40-year-old sort of mentality. There was this fixation on 1940, 1945. It's 40 years ago. Like looking back now, what's 23 right now, so that would be 84 40 years ago.
Yeah.
But in 1980, the war wouldn't have barely even started in 1940.
Yeah.
So they were closer to 1940 than we are now to 1980.
Yeah.
And so even 3 years ago, we were thinking like the 80s was 40 years ago exactly, 3 years ago. That the first year.
Yeah.
That creates this like sort of acute nostalgia when you realize something's 40 years old, no matter who you are. I mean, as long as you have some sense for the past and you know how long 40 years can be,
Yeah.
I mean, you have some dim idea about it, then you're gonna have some intense nostalgia, unless you just live under a rock. So I've talked to people who are quite older than me, and they used to say like in the late '70s and the '80s, people were really obsessed with the sort of the racing culture, the greaser scene in the '50s, and obviously the lifestyle that was preliminary to that in the '40s.
That kind of ties us into Blue Velvet, I guess. But did you watch that?
I thought we remarked on Blue Velvet. I mean, that seems a little bit like a side qual because I think we did a podcast on Blue Velvet. If we haven't, we could do it because I know everything about that movie, just about everything I need to know.
I mean, I don't want to segue and just kind of jump around endlessly because that would just probably be unsatisfying or something. But like, just what you're saying about there's an intense nostalgia that pops in these 40-year drums. Like
Blue Velvet was, by the way, Okay, so this does segue. I mean, we can talk about it in a different way than we talked about it before. Blue Velvet was a 1986 neo-noir film of a kind. It was stylized aggressively into a Lynchian mode. David Lynch directed it. I don't know if he wrote it. I think he had some hand in writing it. David Lynch wrote it too. He was an auteur, right? Even then. But Blue Velvet it was a movie that came out after his sort of fall from grace because I believe he made Dune earlier on, and I quite liked the early '80s Dune. Like that's something that's more like Mad Max, a lot like Mad Max, and we could directly tie it into Mad Max. But it was panned by critics in a lot of cases, and it failed. It was tanked in the box office. He had a lot of leeway because he had got Anthony Hopkins an Oscar for his Elephant Man. And so he had a lot of leeway for a while, but then he made Dune, and Dune was just like a mammoth failure. And he an extinct elephant, yes, corpse, frozen for all oblivion. And so he comes out. Eventually, he has a sort of return to form with Blue Velvet. Now, Blue Velvet sounds like this sort of honeymoon sort of. I don't know how to explain. Like the saccharine sort of cheesy '50s, doo-wop, drive-in flick, like a romantic kind of comedy, romantic feature.
Well,
but
the
it's
fact
not.
that there's a double meaning there,
It's a
the
rip
double,
off on that, and it's but like you're
yeah,
saying, in '86 there was this insane nostalgia for like the '50s and '40s, and Blue Velvet is
yeah,
sort of like the death knell of that.
yeah.
It represents the end to that nostalgia at the broadest level.
Well, it's in a way, it's kind of a culmination, I think, sort of.
I wouldn't call it an apotheosis, but I do think it represents sort of like the beginning of the decline in that nostalgia,
Yeah.
the falling off of the peak nostalgia, the peaking of nostalgia. But I think the film itself may not represent that peak. I think it represents the far side of the peak where the decline has already long begun.
What would you say is the peak, if there is
Well,
one?
what's interesting is that I do think like someone like Roy Orbison. Roy Orbison contributed music to that
Yeah,
film, and he did not like the way it was used initially. He really resented it, but after time, he came around to it and was like, you know what? I can see why it worked in the scene the way it did, and that to me
yeah,
is like the ultimate like crushing blow, because it's like, okay, Roy Orbison's like the consummate, you know, crooner from that whatever he was. He was more of a pop
yeah,
singer, but dream idol singer, right? Roy Orbison.
yeah, yeah,
And then he even 4 octave range, incredible talent, a litany of hits. And then even he is looking back after Elvis has died, Johnny Cash, all these people are just sort of sidelined, but Roy Orbison still means something. Even he is sort of
yeah.
forced to surrender to like this kind of
Mhm.
degenerate refocusing of the culture he grew he rose to fame in, the culture that he helped define.
I see
He
what you mean.
he even
Because,
he is
yeah,
sort of
so because,
surrendering to this mockery of it,
yeah,
by
yeah,
acknowledging the brilliance of David Lynch's you know directorial decisions with his music.
yeah. Well, yeah, but I mean, well, this is again kind of going off topic, but do you think there's a film that sort of is
The tip of oh yeah, the nostalgia. Yeah,
yeah,
I think like Fast Times at Ridgemont High is a good one.
yeah.
Yeah,
What
because
about
Fast Times at let me see the year. That might have been. So like if there's a movie that is like 82. Okay, yeah. So
yeah,
82, perfect. And I
yeah.
just saw this again. Fast Times. I
What
actually
about
this
American Graffiti? That's almost like an early version of it, wouldn't you say?
American Graffiti was in the early 70s.
Yeah,
American
well, that's what I'm
Graffiti
saying.
was actually, it was a whole different can of worms, because American Graffiti was George Lucas, his personal nostalgia for his hometown of Modesto. And then
Yeah,
he as he grew out of Modesto and grew up and left and went to LA or whatever he did. I think he went to UCLA or USC something. He went to
but
community
you're
college.
basically,
He went to community college in Modesto for a minute, but then he went to like
yeah.
UCLA, I think.
But
Anyway,
you're basically saying that because it's such a personal vision, it doesn't fit into this like
no,
collective societal.
no, the American Graffiti was designed as it was more of a purist film. It was designed to actually represent the way people operated in the '50s in the cruising scene.
Yeah, I see. It wasn't this weird, ironic
It
representation.
wasn't like a low key criticism or like a fetish. It wasn't a nostalgic fetishization. It was trying to be
Yeah,
more of like it was nostalgic organically, but it wasn't like an artificial nostalgia for like the next generation,
yeah, yeah,
as far as I could tell. And he actually moved
yeah,
when he shot the Modesto scenes. He actually didn't shoot in Modesto because Modesto had changed too much. So he went to Petaluma and San Rafael up in the northern San Francisco Bay Area, and he thought that those
yeah.
actually reflected the town he grew up in more than Modesto did at the time that he was shooting.
No, I felt that same thing. I mean, at least a few years ago, I went to Sebastopol, just passing through, and I felt like it felt like Mill Valley more than Mill Valley does now. Like the progress of whatever.
Yeah, well, oh yeah, Mill Valley. Yeah, certain. It's funny how like certain towns change, and then other towns nearby start to like embody the energy, and like they sort of like steal their qualities and stuff. It's
Yeah,
almost like
it's
ghost
like
energies
warmth or
moving,
something.
shifting around before our
Yeah,
noses.
it's like you have this epicenter and it slowly warms the surrounding area or something, or it radiates. So like there's no
Yeah,
way I can
yeah. Oh
describe
yeah,
it.
yeah. It's like it's a conductive sort of energy. Yeah, energy, thermal.
Yeah.
Cooling and heating, reheating
But
and stuff.
anyway, that's
Anyway,
all getting way off topic.
Fast Times at Ridgemont High, despite its reputation as sort of this goofy stoner comedy, it's actually not quite like that when you watch it. When you watch it, it's got this good old boy charm to it, where it's like it's sort of presupposing this innocence
Yeah.
in the American youth that later
Yeah.
films did not presuppose,
Hmm.
and it sort of it played up the faults in people in a way that caricaturized them, rather than vilified them. And
Yeah.
by ramping up, like amplifying the faults in certain characters, it sort of lost the ability to do social commentary, and narrowly avoided being an ironic film by just being so kind of absurd. Like like it lost its sort of it was going in circles rather than going in any specific direction. And
Yeah, it didn't have the goal was not to put anything down. It was almost like just dwelling with the intriguingness of certain tropes or certain
yeah, the
realities or
tropes
something.
from like a
Mhm.
50s portrayal, like American Graffiti, were self similar in Fast Times at Ridgemont High. The difference was that society did change, and society was that had to be acknowledged on some level. So what they did was they just added all this humor in to, like, sort of like paste over the fact that the world had changed. I guess like they were
Hmm.
sort of being playing pig ignorant by making everything a bigger joke than it actually was.
Weird.
Like they kind of like, for instance, the character. Okay, we remember Sean Penn's character is the stoner, the surfer. That's a kind of
I never saw the movie.
Oh, okay. Just to get like, there's like three sort of main characters.
Yeah.
There's a guy who works at a burger shack who views himself as like an entrepreneur. He's really proud of the fact that he has a job while in high school. That's the guy who I thought was the maitre d' in Blues Brothers, by the way.
I see. Yeah, he was
And I
pretty
forget
well
his
known.
name, but he was like, he's a pretty tall actor. He was one of the three main characters. The other guy is a Sean Penn with long hair who plays a stoner that's always pranking his history teacher. And this guy, you'd think that he would be like in every scene or something. He's not in the movie as much. He's sort of, in retrospectively, people view him as the highlight of the film, I think. But I think when the film came out, he wasn't necessarily that crucial. Um, and then the third one was this
Yeah.
character that is a high school student, I believe, but he scalps concert tickets to rock concerts, like Blue Oyster
Yeah.
Cult, or maybe not Zeppelin, but like The Who, or whoever was big in the early. Van Halen is mentioned a lot. So Van Halen's kind of a running joke in this movie, and so Van Halen also represents like this immortality of the American dream, right? It's like just pure fun energy. It's never undying energy, but in the music context, and it's a consumer context as well. So these people, like, they go see Van Halen. At the end of the movie, they have a credit sequence which shows where everyone went in like 10 years. Like
I've
they have
seen
like
that like parodied or something.
they did like a kind of like a mockery of that, where they had 10 years after what happened to each character. And the Sean Penn character, he saved someone like Demi Moore, or some actress, I forget
Yeah.
who in a surfing accident. He saved her from a shark, and then she gave him so much money that he was able to waste all that money on getting Van Halen to play for his birthday party.
It's funny.
And that was his claim to fame 10 years later. So they were like talking about how like this good old American guy, high schooler, is sort of just like, he's sort of stuck in this, like, not really the past, not really the future, just stuck in the present, always in the present. And they're forcing this sort of positive lens on everything. And like the guy who works at the Burger Shack in Fast Times, he ends up losing his job, and then he works at someplace else, and he saves, but he ends up he works at like a shitty convenience store, but he ends up saving the whole like town because he takes down an armed robber. And so even that shitty job at the convenience store, which was already a downgrade from working at the Burger Shack, which is pretty shitty, that ends up being like this weird forced positivity where no matter what he's doing, he's winning. Like no matter what he does, he succeeds. He can go as low as he can go and he still succeeds. The other guy who's selling the tickets, he ends up working at 7-Eleven. But it's a positivity thing too, because during the whole movie, he's like, hey man, I need to get a real job. I need to go work at 7-Eleven and stop selling these concert tickets. I need to get a real job, work at 7-Eleven. So he ends up going and selling tickets at 7. It goes up and working at 7-Eleven. And there's this atmosphere of like loserdom that's like going to hit these white American teens, but their attitude is so like oblivious to how like loserish it is that the film in 1982 when it was released is really on the precipice of some great of like 30 years 40 years of negativity about American society. But it's like hitting up against it with all the irony in the world.
Wow, but it doesn't quite hit it. It's like the wave is about to
The
crest.
wave is about to crash. The tsunami is about to destroy the village, but they're still in denial. It's like it's the perfect representation of what you're talking about, where they really believe in this 50s nostalgia and they're just not going to let go.
Wow.
And then later on, in the 90s, you get Richard Linklater, who does Dazed and Confused, and that's kind of like the 90s sort of like a more down to earth version of Fast Times, where the characters are more questionable, and they let it all hang out, and they're not so like self satisfied. They're a little more devious, a little more like human, I guess, a little more not, you know what I mean, like they're less plastic. But that's supposed to sort of re-glorify the new America, which, to be fair, that was a nostalgia for the 70s, not the 50s. Dazed and Confused, because it was 91, but it was representing high school in the 70s. In the 90s, the 70s was considered like kind of like a fun time in a way, because I don't want to get into it too much, but because it really, there's a lot of layers to it. At different decades, certain decades are nostalgized more than others, right? 80s goes to 50s, 90s kind of goes to 70s, 60s. So because a lot of people view the early 70s as kind of like the late 60s, and a lot of people view the late 70s as kind of like the early 80s, right? The 70s is an easy decade to cut into. The 80s, but then now we're getting back to what we're talking about, which is Fast Times. No, sorry, not Fast Times. Blue Velvet, 86. The wave has crashed. The tsunami has destroyed the village. And now if you portray, it's like a joke to portray the 50s as some, joyful era, right? It's some good old time, like America at its finest. It's a joke to do that, and so and everyone kind of knows it. And so in the late 80s, where so people like the idea of the 50s being this cool and nostalgic, but they don't lean into it too much because there's a deep awareness that it was a flawed era. So in Blue Velvet, the criminals, the villains, are so nefarious and they're so nefariously disgusting or disgustingly nefarious that you really don't feel like there's any goodness to this town that's being portrayed whatsoever, even though it's just one small aspect of it. You still, it's just so all consuming and front and center that you just don't feel like the town has any good qualities, even though objectively it has to.
Well, I think, I mean, I think there's a scene in there where the protagonist Jeremy is saying like, why does there have to be people like Frank in this world? Which I think is basically sort of summing that up. Like the existence of extreme radical evil. Like there's a point to be made that kind of spoils. Like you could have a ton of goodness, but like one figure of extreme insane evil just proves that goodness is sort of illusory. Or,
well,
I
that
mean,
yeah,
it
that
would
was the
seem
that
to.
was
And
sort
then
of
by the end of the movie,
that was the
there's a kind
effect
of
of that
reconciliation.
movie. Yeah, that movie was very grim.
But I do think there's a kind of reconciliation at the end. I mean, and I don't think that's ironic, really, which is why Lynch is sort of interesting. He kind of he fools you by making you think he's being ironic, and in a to an extent he is. He's obviously not saying the '50s were paradise. But I think it's less social commentary and more like the '50s are used as like a symbol of like this blind, stupid optimism, which they kind of
Because
were.
that blind, stupid optimism was correct for its time in a way. But
Yeah,
the
I mean, I
problem is
think
that this
I think
film
that's the,
is made in a year that's part of the sub decade, a subdivision in a decade that has a lot of strange ideas about the 50s altogether. Like in the early
yeah
80s, it was a lot more of like a sort of crackhead nostalgia, like just overzealous pie in the sky
yeah
nostalgia. And then the late 80s is
with
more of like a
Miyazaki.
fetishization of the 50s. It's not really a nostalgia anymore, but they sort of still fetishize the 50s.
Yeah, it becomes almost like symbolic, you know.
It becomes a symbol of something, and yeah, an icon,
Yeah,
but it's no longer like a
yeah,
material coexistence.
yeah, exactly. I mean, I think it'd be because that. I mean, that's the exact thing. Blue Velvet isn't set in the '50s. Like it's set in this weird time that
Twilight
is
Zone
neither.
sort of contemporary 80s time that resembles the 50s quite a lot in mood, but
Yeah,
also in materiality. Yeah,
well, and also just with a lot of like little touches here, and like the ambulance that picks up the lady, and that there are a lot of little. It's
the
like it's
production design.
amazing
Yeah.
how he makes it work and how it doesn't ever jar or feel dissonant. It's like incredible.
Yeah, they're forcing this materiality to exist, which I think at that point was losing its luster, right? Like I just said this, like the it's being fetishized, but that movie doesn't just fetishize
You're right. Yeah.
it forces a veneer of nostalgia, but the audience would look at that and know it as bullshit in '86.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's a very clever film. And
Yeah.
obviously the villain in that is I think who's the actor's name was from
Easy Rider,
Easy
Dennis Hopper.
Rider. I was gonna say yeah, Easy Rider. Why am I blanking? Keaton,
Dennis
Michael
Hopper.
Keaton.
It's Dennis Hopper.
Was it Michael Keaton?
No, it's Dennis Hopper.
Dennis Hopper. That's right. Dennis Hopper. Yeah, he's really nasty in that film, and excellent portrayal. And then some of the practical effects that are gory are very
No, you just okay.
are very good. The practical effects for some of the violent scenes
Yeah.
are very good.
Yeah.
Like they sort of hammer in this idea that like there's an underbelly, a seedy one to society that would that horrify anyone if they just looked beyond the curtain a little.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
Yeah. I love,
I think that's about a wrap. We talked about like six movies, um,
yeah.
or four again, four plus a few nods to some classics that definitely
Yeah.
tie into everything we've talked about, and
Yeah.
could really be talked about more on their own, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Anyway, let me see if I can save this recording because I think it was a pretty good episode.
Yeah.
Okay, how we did about an hour and 10. All right, so let's just decompress for the next couple minutes. Uh,
Sure.
we're still recording. How is the what do you want to watch for the next ones? Maybe we should decide now.
Yeah. That's a good question. I could watch Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I kind of want to watch that, but maybe we should just go another direction.
We can do that. We could do that in like a later. We could cycle that out a bit more.
We could watch some sort of cowboy movies, maybe.
Yeah, I'd love
I
to.
have
Yeah. Do you like how about that classic The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance or
yeah, I could
that's
see that.
Valance. The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance. You might like that one.
Yeah.
And then we could do that and we could do Unforgiven. How about those two? Very
Okay.
far removed in time when they were
Yeah.
made, but they have some underlying commonalities in theme that'd be worth examining.
Yeah. Like just looking
And
at
they're just
them
fun movies to explore, like top to bottom, like motifs and all that probably have their common.
Yeah.
Unforgiven is a Clint Eastwood film. It's directed by him. I think he won Best Picture for it or Best Actor for it.
Yeah.
And it was done in the 90s when he was an old man. And then The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance is John Wayne in it. But John Wayne isn't always the most driving character. Like the drama isn't necessarily dependent on him. There's other characters in that film that kind of move the story. I forget the name of the actor, but very famous actors in that too. Not Gary Cooper. I don't know. I forget the names. I don't know all those old movies, the names that well. Here, let me look it up. You can commit to this?
Yeah, I can commit to watching those.
Okay.
And maybe we can drill. I mean, I feel like if we do the podcast closer to when we have seen the movies,
John Ford, James Stewart. That's who it is. James Stewart.
We can sort of pick up on the little details, which can be more rewarding. I mean, I think there's something rewarding in the like broad strokes approach. They're both valid.
Morgan Freeman is in Unforgiven, and so he's the deuteragonist. And then James Stewart is the deuteragonist in.
Well, I'm gonna watch the older one first.
In Valance, and also Gene Hackman's the antagonist in Unforgiven, and there's a very good antagonist in Valance. I forget his name. Maybe Lee Marvin. I don't know. Yeah, Lee Marvin. Yeah, I was right.
Wow, good memory.
Anyway, and then as just like as an extra credit, how about watch 310 to Yuma, the one with Russell Crowe. Do you have a problem with Russell Crowe? Because I know you didn't want to see Gladiator.
I did end up seeing Gladiator. I don't. It's not about him. It was just the movie. I don't know. Wasn't that?
How much didn't you couldn't complete Gladiator?
Yeah, I ended up seeing the whole thing though.
Oh, okay, cool. So maybe watch 310 to Yuma, and then we could do a double feature where we talk about 310 to Yuma in parallel with Gladiator or whatever, as a perpendicular film to Gladiator.
Yeah.
Because I think 310 to Yuma might be a better film than Gladiator. It's not Ridley Scott directing it. I forget who directs it.
I think. I think we can only really do two. I think, and because I sort of want to try and go into the details of it as much as possible. You know.
It was based off an Elmore Leonard story. And it was 1957 was the original, and they remade it in 2007. With Christian Bale and Russell Crowe, and James Mangold directed it. I think you should watch it, man. It's one of my favorite films.
Okay.
But do it when you have time. Like the first two are way more crucial.
Yeah. All right.
And so for that, we'll sign off, and I gotta go do some stuff anyway, like really urgently.
Okay.
I'm glad we had this. I think this was a good session. I'm glad we had this ability to sort of synthesize everything. What were you saying about you think the thematic approach versus a more tactical?
Oh, just that if we see the movies closer to like when we talk about them,
it's better.
Like, yeah, because we remember more details, which it's not necessarily better, but like, we can alternate between or whatever.
Yeah, and also you get sometimes when you seen a movie a long time ago, you don't remember scenes that well. Like frankly, like
exactly.
You remember the vibe.
The general as well. You could lose the general impression.
You don't notice details anymore. You can't like rack through your brain and just remember details. You have to like do that. Like details are always have to be the freshest kind of.
And there's something very rewarding in sort of finding detail which supports your interpretation in a very like, sort of seemingly undeniable way. You know?
There are details that you can remember long term, of course, but like but it's they're more likely to have been talked about before than if you watch them like, a week ago. Less people in the world will have are likely to have talked about them just because of how the culture keeps changing, right? Whereas if you saw something 20 years ago and you're still talking about it, other people are gonna have not gonna have as much originality.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Anyway, I'll sign off, man. Let me stop the recording now.